So I'd like to welcome everyone to this online meeting. The title is Covid-19, a Geo-Political Watershed. It's being hosted by the Bolshevik Tendency. So just to explain the format, there'll be a 35-minute presentation by Roxy, followed by a discussion round, then a 10-minute summary by Roxy. If there is time, we'll take another round of discussion with a final summary by Roxy. If you want to speak in the discussion, use the raise hand option in Zoom. When that happens, I'll give you a choice of whether to use video when you speak or just audio. You should note, if you haven't used this webinar feature under Zoom before, that the way we're doing it, when you're given the ability to speak, there'll be a short disconnect and reconnect as Zoom changes your status from attendee to a panelist. And the same will happen, that short disconnect and reconnect, when you're finished speaking and you get put back to being an attendee. As we've got a few people on the attending, just over 25 people so far, to facilitate as many contributions as possible, we'd like to ask that people try and get their contributions to around 3 minutes. If you just want to ask a question without speaking or using video, just please put that in the chat and I will ask that on your behalf. If you have any technical issues, please put that in the chat as well and I'll try to respond as best I can. Otherwise, we'd ask that people please refrain from using the chat. I've been in a few of these and it can tend to distract away from the main presentation and discussion if people get discussions going inside the chat. Just to let people know that we plan to make an audio version of this meeting available on our website, hopefully not too long in the future. That's bolsheviktendency.org. So thank you all for coming, and I'll now hand over to Roxy to start the meeting.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name's Roxy. I'm based in London and I'm a member of the Bolshevik Tendency, a Trotskyist organisation. So yeah, welcome to our forum on COVID-19 and its geopolitical impacts. If you've chosen to attend this forum today, you might be worried about this watershed moment for humanity and perhaps wanting some debate and discussion on the significance of this and what to do about it as revolutionaries and workers. The global economy was already turning downward after the 2008 crisis, but the unprecedented global economic shutdown due to the pandemic has triggered an unprecedented economic crisis. And commentators all around the world are now likening it to the Great Depression of the 1930s, but this time it's different, because it's the speed at which things have gone downhill that's so astonishing. For equivalent kinds of economic devastation to play out in the 2008 crisis and the Great Depression, it took about 3 years. In the current crisis, it took 3 weeks. That's how Nouriel Roubini put it in late March. Roubini, the economics professor who correctly predicted the 2008 financial crisis, and who also in a more recent interview this month explained that 22 million jobs were built up over 10 years since the last depression. And then we lost 30 million jobs in 2 months. And that's compared to about 22 million overall in the 2008 crisis. And this is largely caused, this massive downturn is largely caused by the double whammy of both a supply shock and a demand shock in this pandemic, with industry shutting down and people staying at home. Specifically in the US, there's now been more than 40 million applications for unemployment benefit, and more people in the US lost their jobs in 1 month in April than in any month in US history. The official current unemployment figure of about 15% in the US will continue rising, and the real rate, when you include those not actively seeking work and those who are underpaid, the latter of which is a massive figure, that rate is closer to 25%. So no wonder there are lines miles long outside food banks, which themselves are suffering shortages. Food riots could be next. And it looks like the other factors that we associate with this type of depression will become a daily reality too, such as homelessness and rising mortality levels and so on. Immigrant and black workers are disproportionately affected all around the world. As always, the neoliberal mix of cutting social services, privatizing public sector assets, and the constant drive for lower labour costs, and decades spent squeezing out excess capacity, promoting lean production and just-in-time delivery. All of this has produced complexly extended supply chains with intricate and narrowly specialised links. So when one thing gets held up, so many companies and industries immediately become affected, as we've seen. So the COVID-19 crisis has starkly revealed how global supply chains can impede the ability of even highly developed economies to rapidly ramp up production and distribution of, for example, medical equipment and other vital products when they're so crucially needed. But this isn't the only problem in producing the medicine and supplies that are necessary. In the US, the medical industrial complex has prepared the ground for the current catastrophe in and of itself. The big pharmaceutical companies are not interested in researching and developing antibiotics and antivirals. They're not nearly as profitable as addictive tranquilizers and treatment for male impotence. That's where the money's at. And shockingly, a universal vaccine for influenza has actually been possible for decades, but it's never been profitable enough to be a priority. Same goes for the scandalous lack of ventilators and PPE. People are, reduced to backroom deals to acquire face masks, whilst their president tells everyone that the virus will disappear like a miracle. And then when it doesn't, resorts to the same kind of social Darwinism, herd immunity that we've had in the UK, where I live, with Boris Johnson's take it on the chin attitude, which explicit or implicit is still the policy here. And the ways that imperialist states like the US and the UK have dealt with every aspect of this pandemic contrast so strikingly with what the deformed worker state China has done. Chinese scientists uploaded a copy of the virus's genome online, and virologists around the world were then able to develop diagnostic tests for the new disease. WHO then later sent out those tests, or tests that were based on this information, but the CDC in the US did its own thing and it failed. So Americans lost precious time there. Now, had the US implemented widespread testing, aggressive tracing and quarantining of those potentially exposed, and locked down regional hotspots, which was, as we know, standard practice in Vietnam, South Korea, China, then the outbreak might have been contained. We know just how far the reality is in the US from these necessary measures, though. But even by the standards of America's insular and notoriously short-sighted ruling class, the Trump administration's record of incompetence on this has been staggering. But meanwhile, whilst apparently highly developed countries failed to get their act together, China was sending tons of equipment to Europe, along with millions of face masks and testing kits. Cuba, another deformed worker state. So by virtue of the fact that its economy is not dominated by the madness of the profit motive and the law of value, has also been able to take part in rational and altruistic actions. It sent 2,000 doctors and nurses abroad. US Congress has its relief bill package, unsurprisingly prioritized big banks massively over small businesses and individual citizens. And one of the most disgusting and degenerate examples of US capitalism at work was the bailing out of so-called zombie firms, which keep afloat by borrowing more and more money and piling up more and more debt. They're defined as companies which can't even cover the debt servicing costs from their current profits over any kind of extended period. In other words, they don't earn enough cash flow to even cover interest payments on their debt. So of course, with the pandemic, they ran into an immediate credit crunch. And rather than letting them go bankrupt, as they should have, according to free market theory, they've essentially been bailed out by the US Treasury. Meanwhile, big investors buy shares, slash and burn tactics with their companies, in acting in drastic ways in order to quickly increase the share prices. which they then sell at a profit and gain immediate short-term access to cash, essentially cannibalizing their own companies through clever financial engineering. There's no long-term investment in this model. So we've got this going on. Then going back to healthcare, there's essentially a bipartisan support in the US for the $1 trillion corporate bailouts and tax cuts. But most of the ruling class at the same time regards the provision of universal Medicare as an unaffordable luxury. But that's proved a false economy, because uninsured workers and those with inadequate coverage who can't afford treatment have helped spread the virus. And the short-sighted denial of sick pay to 45% of the workforce in the US has had similar consequences, forcing those who become ill to keep working in order to pay their bills, which is a reality for many, many people around the world. So in many ways, we're seeing the social fabric of America, such as it was, disintegrate. And the erosion of confidence in the ruling elite is one of the reasons for the enormous surge in the sale of guns and ammunition in the US. Ultimately, the trillions of dollars being created out of thin air to rescue the insolvent Wall Street banks and debt-ridden zombie corporations, coming after a similar bailout in 2008, as well as the estimated $6 trillion squandered since 2001 in the failed attempt to establish control of the Middle East and its energy resources. All of this must inevitably hasten the day that the US dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency. In a multipolar world where the dollar would be merely one currency among many, Washington will lose the privileges that it's taken for granted since during its 75-year reign as the arbiter of the global financial system, including the power to sanction other countries by obstructing their ability to conduct international financial transactions. A significant step in this direction came in late March with the EU's first successful use of the Instex system to send medical equipment to Iran in defiance of US sanctions. And then there's the emerging Chinese digital yuan currency, which will have similar effects. And the eventual loss of the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency will mean that Washington can no longer bridge gaps between income and expenses by simply raising the debt ceiling. You know, when debts can no longer be paid by issuing treasury bills and printing dollars, America's rulers will discover that borrowing actually requires saving, just as consumption requires production. From an ecological perspective, scientists and anyone paying attention has known what was coming for a while with this pandemic. The deforestation and increasing human encroachment into wildlife habitats, urbanization, globalization, the devastating effects of industrial agriculture, they weren't going to go unchecked for much longer. Epidemics like this happen because of what we do to nature. And of course, all of these policies that are destroying the biosphere are driven by the imperatives of profit maximization, as is the wholesale overuse of antibiotics by corporate agribusiness in their industrial poultry and livestock factories, which have led to antibiotic resistant superbugs, which is a phenomenon that the WHO called a global health emergency. But as is frequently the case, the short-term benefits of these antisocial practices accrue to the shareholders of the corporations, which carry them out, while the expenses incurred as a consequence of the infections that result from it, which capitalist economy theory dismisses as externalities, they are left to be borne by society as a whole. Another result of this pandemic is food shortages, which we may find will become the new normal, an unintended consequence of the imposition of sweeping international travel restrictions in response to the pandemic has seen a severe labour shortage in Britain, the US and other countries that rely on a migrant agricultural workforce. But concerns about shortages of fresh fruit and vegetables in the near term as a result of restrictions on migrant labour are nothing compared to the uncertain future for food production created by the increasing rate of climate change. The IPCC sketched some of the implications of climate breakdown for global food production. For example, if nothing drastic changes in order to reduce emissions, the Himalayan glaciers will just disappear within a single human lifetime. Half of Asia's population depends on water that flows from those Himalayan glaciers, not only for drinking and other household needs, but more importantly for agriculture. So with it gone, it's just going to rip the heart out of the region's food system and leave 800 million people in crisis. And that's just in Asia. Droughts and desertification already happening. Some of the most drastic signs of climate change. They are going to destroy whole sections of the earth, which means destroying food growing regions. And as the earth gets hotter, we're not going to be able to grow key staples to feed ourselves. And of course, agriculture also is a major contributor. Nearly a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions are caused by it. And the industrial model of farming is a major contributing factor to the emergence of pandemics, as well as its contribution to climate change. Now, I mentioned China earlier. The globalization of the production of drugs and medical equipment has given the Chinese deformed worker state a central role in this pandemic. For example, Chinese factories that manufacture most of the ventilators have been working overtime to fill urgent orders from around the world. And there's been much talk in the Western bourgeois media about the initial attempts by the local Chinese Communist Party authorities to attempt to suppress news of the COVID-19 outbreak, which is true. But the central leadership eventually managed to restrict the spread of the virus to Wuhan and its surrounding areas very successfully, in contrast to most of the far richer imperialist countries. Chinese authorities, using draconian police measures, enforced mass quarantines, travel bans, and the shutdown of daily life. And it was that, just like the rapid expansion of the production of medical equipment and supplies, and the building of whole new hospitals in a matter of days, all of this was facilitated by China's centrally planned economy. It was able to do this, even given the bureaucratically distorted nature of that planning, under the bureaucratic Stalinist Communist Party. It was able to do it despite the significant capitalist infested parts of the economy. But nonetheless, deformed as it is, it's still a society with central planning, run very differently to a capitalist one. And it was all of this which enabled it to achieve these things. And you saw similar results at first were achieved by capitalist Singapore's authoritarian regime, until the living and working conditions of their migrant workforce meant another outbreak, which is still now having to be contained. Anyway, China's record contrasts sharply with most of the self-styled free world. So China steps in and it sold vital equipment to Italy when appeals went out for emergency medical equipment in Europe. No one else stepped in, so China did. And in this way, it was able to promote goodwill and expand its influence. And as well as providing tons of equipment for Europe, Beijing also dispatched assistance to Venezuela, Iran, Cambodia, different countries in Africa, and other underdeveloped countries. So it's just not comparable to how imperialist and neo-colonial countries function. So the Chinese deformed worker state has stepped up to play the leading role in providing medical equipment and supplies for much of the world, whilst the US imperialist superpower, which has shown itself completely unable to control the outbreak even within its own borders, is at the same time lashing out with absurd and irrational denunciations of China. And of course, what Washington fears is that the long-term net impact will be to add momentum to Beijing's Belt and Road Eurasian integration initiative and bring down the curtain on American global hegemony. That's what the American ruling class is worried about. And China knows that this is a good opportunity to shine, to expand its Belt and Road initiative. But the US is not going to allow China to expand its own economy peacefully. So instead, Trump spouts lies about a Chinese virus, denies his own blatant racism. And, you know, the sections of the US ruling class are embarrassed at the undeniable contrast between these two states. And the pandemic has exposed so graphically America's inability to adapt to this reshaping of the geopolitics of globalization. It's in denial. And it's drastically failing the test on every front of what a global leader would be doing in response to a crisis. Meanwhile, China is quickly filling that vacuum. And much of Beijing's rising status derives from the simple fact that much of what the world depends on to fight the coronavirus is made in China. And China's current status of the so-called workshop of the world derives from the 1949 social revolution, which uprooted imperialist influence, expropriated the indigenous capitalists, collectivized the means of production. But Marxists advocate a workers' political revolution to overturn the ruling Stalinist bureaucracy. We give no political support to this Stalinist bureaucracy, but at the same time, we defend the Chinese worker state in any conflict with capitalist powers. Moving away from China now, for years, Iran has been among the chief victims of American financial sanctions. And the Trump administration has seized on the outbreak of COVID-19 as a means to increase pressure on Tehran. And this criminal stupidity of this maximum pressure campaign has outraged some of the more rational members of the American bourgeoisie who understand that COVID-19 poses a global threat requiring a coordinated international response. But the Trump administration is too short-sighted to see that it's in the US's own self-interest to make sure that everywhere in the world is able as best it can to fight the spread of the virus, including in Iran. I like the way that Jarrett Blanc, a former US State Department official, put it. So he's no friend of the working class, but even he said, anyone who argues otherwise or does otherwise is a sociopath or a moron. Another commentator concurred and said that the maximum pressure campaign on Iran is unjust anyway, but to continue it in the midst of a public health disaster is truly sick and twisted. And that is exactly what it is. This US policy of collective punishment of the Iranian people was also condemned by Human Rights Watch, which noted that on several occasions, US officials have indicated that the pain that the US sanctions are causing for ordinary Iranians is intentional. It's part of a strategy to compel Iranian citizens to demand their autocratic government to change behavior. So it's a recipe for collective punishment that infringes on Iranians' economic rights. And apart from anything else, it's not working anymore. Another challenge to the US kind of unilateral and widespread use of financial sanctions on states like Iran are the new emerging digital currencies, in particular the Chinese one. Iran and China are already working together on how to link up their systems. Washington is pursuing a similarly cruel and stupid policy in Venezuela, where it also hopes to use the pandemic as a lever for regime change. So while China was sending kits that reportedly could serve to test 300,000 Venezuelans, the IMF, dominated by the US, cynically turned down a request by Caracas for assistance on the specious grounds that it lacked clarity as to the Maduro government's legitimacy, which was obviously a clear reference to the absurd claim of the US puppet Juan Guaido to the Venezuelan presidency. So what do? Well, until large-scale testing and tracking can ensure that the outbreak is under control, it's obviously necessary to keep all non-essential workers, all non-essential workplaces closed, while guaranteeing full pay for those affected. And yet, one country after another around the world has tried to lift their lockdown way too early, after having not started them early enough in the first place, or having a really embedded mass testing program in place. And so now they're having to firefight rather than rationally manage the situation. Frontline health workers, as well as others deemed essential workers like grocery store workers, they should have their pay doubled and provided with every possible form of protection against infection. Anyone who tests positive for the virus, whether or not they're showing symptoms, they must be immediately quarantined and given immediate access to free, top quality treatment. And in all cases, their incomes must be maintained and their jobs guaranteed whilst they are sick and being cared for. And all workers must have sick pay coverage. We need centralised and coordinated action. And the resources must be allocated to meet need, regardless of considerations of private profit. And actually, there's nothing inherently socialist about such obviously necessary measures. They are just called for in order to prevent social disintegration by safeguarding the health and well-being of the population. One thing that we must, of course, be really aware of is the state authorities seeking to normalise mass digital surveillance and various other authoritarian measures. An extreme example of this is Hungary, where the right-wing Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been granted the right to rule by decree for an indefinite period. And the new laws are inevitably, as always, being used against the left and the critics of his government. As always, they are in all these types of states around the world, not just in Hungary. But the COVID-19 emergency, if we try to look for the positives in this awful situation, it does actually give us the opportunity to promote collective action. And many ordinary working people, already aware that capitalism is a social system characterized by profound social inequality, know that the future pandemics that will come our way under this system will be dealt with just as catastrophically, again, if we don't prioritize the needs of the vast majority, rather than catering to the whims of a tiny slither of wealthy social parasites, the system we live under now. And we need to be ready to counter the increased police state repression that will try to clamp down on attempts to change the system, as well as the xenophobic, right-wing populist or outright fascist movements that historically have always arisen in such times of deep discontent and anxiety. We may well now be at a juncture today in which, as Marx and Engels put it, we either have the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or the common ruin of the contending classes. There have been some instances of overt class struggle around the world, but they've been somewhat limited and geographically isolated. For example, the walkouts by Amazon and other warehouse workers, the various strikes by auto workers around the world. And in the US, there's been attempts to organize rent strikes and mass resistance to evictions. And although there have been, in reaction to this, bans on evictions during the crisis, some leftist organizers are going further and demanding that rent be waived altogether, not merely postponed for the duration of the crisis. And it's clear that the coronavirus pandemic has produced a heightened sense of vulnerability among hundreds of millions of people, and it's popularized the notion that society has a responsibility to provide everyone with equal access to high quality medical care rather than rationing treatment on the basis of your ability to pay. And then from this recognition, it's actually quite a short step to see that the other essentials of human life and happiness, food, shelter, education, meaningful employment, etc., that they should be available to everyone. And of course, this can only be achieved by reorganizing the economy to make meeting human need and not private property and private profit the priority. And the possibility of utilizing the enormous potential of scientific knowledge and technology to free humanity from scarcity, insecurity, and inequality can only be realized through revolutionary struggle to uproot this capitalist dog-eat-dog social system. And this requires the construction of a disciplined mass revolutionary workers' movement on an international basis, along the lines of the Bolshevik Party that led the Russian workers to victory in 1917. But of course, the left is so much weaker than it was in 1917, or even in the 1960s and 70s. But nonetheless, the immense possibilities exist for a leftist resurgence. And the social devastation incurred by the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, combined with a massive economic downturn, makes it clear that we're entering into a period of intense social turmoil. And the vast majority of the world's peoples, including the relatively privileged and historically insulated populations of the imperial heartlands, are going to come to the stark realization that the existing capitalist social order is incapable of offering a secure future for them or their children or their grandchildren because of the ecological and social devastation that it has semi-automatically engendered. And we may be moving away from decades of relative stasis and bourgeois democratic electoralism towards some combination of a strong state propped up by artificially intelligent surveillance and naked brute force. So this then poses a situation fundamentally similar to that described by Leon Trotsky in his transitional program of 1938. The question is one of life and death and of the future of humankind. And our ability to change it or not was and is, as Trotsky described it, a question of the relationship of forces. And the burning issue that will dictate this relationship of forces is the necessity to resolve the historical crisis of the leadership of the proletariat, which can only be done through the construction of a revolutionary party rooted in the international workers' movement. Now, we are a long way from the realization of that goal, but that's our necessary starting point. And we in the Bolshevik tendency look forward to participating in the necessary splits and fusions among the existing formations of the revolutionary left, some of whom are quite close to us on some questions, which we hope can then culminate in the rebirth of Trotsky's Fourth International. And we want to be part of the coming leftist resurgence and the struggles that are required to forge the political instrument, the International Revolutionary Party, that can once and for all liquidate capitalist slavery. And we don't have any other choice, that is the task of revolutionaries and workers around the world. Okay, thanks for listening. Let's have some discussion.
Okay, you just mute yourself, Roxy?
Yep.
Okay, there are a few people who've come on since we started, just to explain how we're going to run things from here. People can indicate if they want to speak. We're going to have a discussion round with people speaking for around 3 minutes maximum. I've got 2 speakers already. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make them panelists. So Robert and Dara who put their hands up so far. I'm about to make you a panelist and you'll get disconnected and reconnected. I now have a third person, Anne, who will come after Robert, Dara, and then Anne. Robert, do you want your video on?
Yeah, sure.
Go.
Okay. Hi, yeah, thanks for that. This is Robert from the supporter of the IBT. I think you made a very good point there, and an area where we agree with you and most of the left disagrees is that China is still a deformed worker state. That's something worth defending. Its reaction to economic shrinkage and was utterly at odds with the leading capitalist states like the US. So it's still worth defending. Secondly, I have a kind of a vague question. To what extent can we view big capital and capitalist states' response in terms of political economy and the dynamics of capitalism? So I'm really thinking in terms of big business has been bailed out while SMEs have gone to the wall. So we have the increasing proletarianization of the petty bourgeoisie. We have, to some extent, the destruction of capital, which counters the law of the tendency of the rate of profits to fall. We have slash and burn tactics, which are, again, the temporary shifting of organic composition of capital in order to increase the rate of profit. And these are reflected in some of the policies, as you mentioned, like the short-term attitude of Trump. Because we you know, let's not just see capitalism's response to this as a catastrophe for us, the working class, which it is, but how is it an advantage to them? In what way are they getting something out of it? I mean, as Lenin said, there's no absolutely hopeless situations for the bourgeoisie. We can't just wait for them to collapse. I mean, and as you said, you know, we can't take the Pablo-Mendeles line. We absolutely, there's no automatic collapse. We still need the Revolutionary Party. That's understanding these dynamics. Thanks. Are you going to
Oh, sorry. I thought, are we going to have a round of, oh, Alan, you're muted.
Yeah. So I've got the next person is Dara.
Yep.
Okay, go.
So I'm Dara. I'm also a supporter of the Bolshevik tendency, and I just wanted to talk about kind of how the revolutionary potential of the organized working classes has really become apparent since the pandemic has struck. We've seen wildcat strikes and spontaneous protests by workers who feel like they're held hostage by their employers, forced to face coronavirus on the front lines while the bosses sit at home safe and sound. Teamsters, factory workers, and other essential labor in North America have struck against insufficient pay and hazardous working conditions. In Italy, in May, a general strike was called against the government's insistence on maintaining business as usual in the face of this devastating pandemic. And a number of workers employed with Amazon, Target, Instacart, and Whole Foods joined coordinated walkouts or stickouts on May Day in what was called an essential workers general strike. And these workers who have gone on strike are demanding that their workplaces be closed because workers are being exposed for no other reason than to keep businesses turning a profit. They've struck at the risk of reprisals from their employers, but they are clearly convinced that there's nothing more important than their health and the safety of the working class community as a whole. In the face of the disaster which the capitalists have led us to, it seems necessary to show that it's the working class themselves who can take all the necessary measures not just from the point of job security against layoffs and wage cuts, but
1 minute.
also to provide high quality universal healthcare, food, shelter, and education to the entire population, not just a rich minority. This can only be achieved by reorganizing the economy to make meeting human needs, not private profit, the priority. And this requires the construction of a disciplined mass revolutionary workers' movement, or on an international basis, along the lines of the Bolshevik Party that led the Russian workers to victory in 1917. Thank you.
Okay, I've got one more speaker so far. If other people want to speak, just a reminder to use the Zoom raise hand feature. Okay, Anne. Maybe.
Okay, can you
Should
hear
be
me?
okay now.
Okay, all right, okay, thanks Roxanne for that talk. Okay, so probably, you won't be, my name's Anne McShane, I'm a Marxist and supporter of the Communist Party, Great Britain weekly worker living in Ireland. Okay, so you won't be surprised, I think, to know that I fundamentally disagree with you on the question of China being a deformed worker state. But what surprised me actually even more than that was the fact that you, in defending the, I suppose, essentially the Chinese bureaucracy, what I would say are a group of oppressors who have systematically oppressed the Chinese working class, you forget about the fact, or perhaps you, well, not forget about, you did mention it, I think, the fact that this virus originated in China, to the best of our knowledge, and it's not an accident that it did originate in China. The nature of industrialized agriculture in China has created the conditions for the emergence of such a virus, and more than that, for the transmission of that virus globally. Now, I'm not saying that that couldn't have happened in a mass industrialized farm in the United States or elsewhere in the world, but the nature of that form of those social relations created the conditions for the development and the transmission of that virus. So that's the first thing, I think, when you're defending the form of the nature of the property relations, you've got to consider that. And I can't see how this is anything except a political defense of that bureaucracy. And what concerns me about it is the fact that you've kind of alibied the bureaucracy and posited that society as an alternative to what the to the United States and Britain.
1 minute.
Okay, so just 1 minute. All right, okay. So, well, look, of course I don't defend the United States and Britain and, the completely ham-fisted way in which neoliberalism has dealt with this. But you could equally look at South Korea. You could look at Germany to some extent, at a more sensible ruling class's approach to the pandemic. So I think that it's very important to factor in those issues, and particularly in order, like, to posit a vision of the working class taking control on a democratic basis of society, rather than this bureaucratized capitalism and a working class who is, so repressed. You can only, you only have to look at the documentaries on the manner in which Chinese factories operate to see just how repressed and disempowered that working class is. Thanks. I'll unmute myself.
It's okay.
Now.
It's okay. I'm okay. I've got Michael next, and then I've got 4 more speakers. Ian, someone who's coming up on my list is Huawei P20 Pro. So I don't know what your name is, but you'll speak after Ian. Then I've got Kathy or Tom. That's their name, and then Carl. So Michael's next.
Unmute my host. All right, I'd just like to ask Roxanne, about China these days. It seems to have contained the virus and its economy is functioning, whereas in the States, the economy is still going to hell on a bicycle. What do you think this will give China vis-a-vis the rest of the imperialist world? For instance, is it just going to give them a little bit more wiggle room, or is there any chance that it would be a major shift of their role in the world if this imbalance continues for like another 6 months to a year? That's it.
Thank you, Michael. Roxy will take those in her summary at the end. Ian?
Okay, yeah, sorry. I'm Ian Donovan. I'm from the liaison committee for the Fourth International. I'm a supporter of the Trotskyist faction in Britain.
Do you want to have your video on?
No, I'll leave it off.
Okay.
The nervous of these things at the moment. So I'm a bit sort of not too keen on being videoed. I mean, I agree with a lot of the stuff that's been said about the need for transitional demands and the need to obviously to fight against the economic attacks that are coming along with the pandemic. And at the same time, obviously, we should firmly support all measures of public health to safeguard the working class against the pandemic, and capitalism should pay for it, basically pay for everything. People who are not at risk from the pandemic shouldn't be working, and they should be on full pay. And if the capitalist system cannot pay for that, then tough. The capitalist system should go. He actually does point to the need for a society based on human need, as Roxy pointed out, and not a society based on profits. And this is actually sharply indicated, sharply illustrated that. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of common ground there. I actually have a different criticism from Anne to what the comrades are saying about China. I mean, I'm in favour of defending China against imperialism, but not on the grounds that it's a deformed worker state anymore. I don't think it is. I think you're stretching. I think the comrades are stretching logic and stretching Trotskyism to argue that this quite evidently to a degree backward semi-colonial nation is not capitalist. It's got more billionaires than the United States, and there is some truth in what Anne says about the nature of capitalist farming and whatever in the emergence of the pandemic. Well, this could happen. This could happen.
1 minute.
It happened to happen in China. It could have happened anywhere. But I think that China is a country that, as people have illustrated, has been talked about before. China has stretched Bukharism to its limits. And it's a holding up as a model of the workshop of the world because its nature of a deformed workers' state. Supposedly, I don't accept that. It sort of stretches the idea. I just wonder why it was never necessary when Trotsky was arguing about this stuff for him to side with Stalin against Bukharin on the basis that Stalin's policies would lead to capitalist restoration. Apparently, you can have Bukharinites and neo-Bukharinites in power for half a century, and it hasn't led to capitalist restoration. I think that's stretching Trotskyism beyond its limits. I think it's very, very clear that capitalism was restored.
That's 3 minutes. Can you wind up?
So I'll wind up. Yeah, around the same time as the rest of the deformed workers, or most of them, were destroyed. And I think it really is stretching logic. I mean, there are some deformed worker states left. North Korea and Cuba are examples, but China, no. I think that really is stretching Trotskyism. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Okay, I'm not sure who this is.
Hello.
If you can introduce yourself.
Harper from the. Yeah, I'm Harper. I'm supporter of the Bolshevik tendency. Yeah, some interesting points on China. I think fundamentally believing has returned to capitalism is, well, really twofold. One is the critical question that Trotsky discussed when discussing the Soviet Union in the 30s, pointing out that in order for a form worker state to become capitalist again, you'd really need an overthrow of the Stalinist bureaucracy in a time protracted conflict between the pro-capitalist wing of of the Stalinist bureaucracy and that sector of the bureaucracy that is tied with their livelihoods to the collectivized property forms. And first, I don't think we have seen any, and certainly no one has been able to point out to any such overthrow comparable to what we've seen in the Soviet Union in 1991. But perhaps more importantly, the assertion that China is merely exploiting its workers is also incorrect. China's financial system is basically state-controlled. You have 4 big state-owned banks. Their fundamental task is to keep the state-owned enterprises afloat, many of which aren't actually profitable. Partly because they have a large, well, by capitalist standards, they have too many workers on their payroll, keeping these workers in jobs and thereby allowing them to have a better livelihood. And in actual fact, if we look at the figures of poverty reduction in China since, well, really since Maoist revolution, but accelerated even in the sort of the reform period, we've seen that over 600 million Chinese have been lifted out of absolute poverty. If China really was a neoliberal capitalist power, that would be a very unusual social phenomenon to witness. And that takes me to the question of China's integration into the world market. Yes, China has opened up to an extent to foreign enterprise, but it's largely done so on a deal.
1 minute.
It has, okay. Certain sections of our working class can be exploited on a level comparable to sort of semi-colonial workforces in Mexico, for example, in sweatshops. But in exchange, we get access to technology. And I think that sort of points us in a way to the question that Michael Kamodi asked earlier, which is where do we see China vis-a-vis the US? China has adopted technology. It's not quite at a level where it can really compete with imperialist powers. And the CCP has ironically started increasing wages and living conditions for workers, and that's documented over the last few years in the most extremely capitalist provinces like Guangdong.
That's 3 minutes. Can you wind up?
So I think in terms of the overall tendency of how livelihoods develop in China vis-a-vis the imperialist world, it's a grave mistake to underestimate where China stands. And that doesn't take away from the fact that we are still calling for a political revolution, one of which, and an example of that quite possibly was around the Tiananmen Square events in 1989, where workers mobilized to roll back the privatizations. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, Carl, just before you start there, just to note I've had a couple of more hands go up. So next I'll have Kathy or Tom, then Savante, then Jason, then Aloha. I've also got some people posting messages in the chat to the panelists, Elliot and Myron. Were you wanting me to read those out as questions, or if you want to speak to those points, please raise your hand. Okay, Carl?
Hi, I'm Carl from Germany. I'm not surprised that the discussion so far was one about the character of China and not so much one about the character and the developments of the Corona crisis. Here in Germany, it seems as the big impact of the crisis, the health crisis, would be something of the past. But now we are in the transformation into the crisis of economy, as in all capitalist states where Corona was to be seen. And Therefore, my main interest is how to combat the so far overwhelming feeling of normal people that normal life should come back. There is not that much eruption of social fights, of strikes and demonstrations. And if demonstrations come up, they are normally from the ultra-right AfD fringe and other curious groups. But unfortunately, the main concern of people is how do we get back to the good old times before Corona? And that these were not the good old times, but normal capitalist exploitation is something that has to be brought home in order to win away at least some of them to a revolutionary perspective, I'm afraid. That's all.
Thank you, Carl. Okay, before we take Kathy or Tom, I'm going to read out two questions. First is from Elliot. With regard to China's planned economy, what about Xi's recent statement that, quote, we've come to the understanding that we should not ignore the blindness of the market, nor should we return to the old path of a planned economy. That was in Bloomberg News on the 23rd of May. And according to that news report, Xi, quote, reiterated the government's stance that markets should play a, quote, decisive role in the economy. And from Myron, I believe the speaker is conflating the spread of avian or swine flu in China with COVID-19. COVID-19 appears to have originated from wild game in a wet market. Okay, Kathy or Tom?
Okay, well, it's going to be Kathy. And I'm speaking as a member of the Bolshevik tendency. And as Roxy mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis has served to highlight the importance of China in the current global economic supply chain. And that's a position that the current Washington administration would very much like to change. The Trump administration has used the current pandemic to crudely demonize China by continually referring to the COVID-19 crisis as the Wuhan virus and claiming against all the evidence that the Chinese authorities deliberately lied and misled the world when the virus first appeared. Trump anti-China hawk Peter Navarro, when he was speaking on a news program for ABC, and this was picked up by multiple American networks as good coin, was stated the virus was spawned in Wuhan province. Patient zero was in November. The Chinese behind the shield of the World Health Organization for 2 months hid the virus from the world and then sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese on aircraft to Milan, New York, and around the world to see that. The current U.S. administration has been dangerously and provocatively upping the ante with China. And on the one hand, he's using this, Trump, to deflect his gross incompetence and failure to deal with the pandemic in the United States, where over 100,000 have died so far. And on the other hand, they regard China as their most dangerous economic rival. Their confrontational and provocative stance towards China has increased geopolitical tensions, with the idea that perhaps there could be all-out war. Current anti-Chinese campaign includes targeting Huawei, which is a giant Chinese telecommunications company, placing restrictions on investment in Chinese stocks, threats to impose new taxes on American companies in China, and extremely confrontational U.S. naval operations in the South China Sea. And it's usually, right recently, the Trump administration had weighed in behind Modi, India's reactionary Hindu nationalist prime minister, in its border dispute with China. And the U.S. has been, of course, had its dirty hands involved in the Hong Kong's democracy, so-called demonstrations, which are now been taken over by pro-imperialist right-wing forces, singing the Stars and Stripes and raising U.S. flags. Trump's intervention in Hong Kong is a further step in the repudiation of Nixon's 1971 1972 One China policy, which recognized Beijing and not Taipei as China's legitimate legitimate government. Mike Pompeo now claims that Hong Kong no longer has its special status.
There's 3 minutes. Can you wind up?
And could lose its special commercial trade rights. Okay, so just to say, of course, we defend the Chinese deformed worker state. I think people who look at it, you have to see that the centrally planned economy, no other country with the size of population could possibly do.
Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry, Kathy. Okay, so my apologies there. Trigger finger. So after Samantha, I've got Jason, Aloha, Christoph, and Stephen.
Right. I'm a member of the League for the Fifth International, its Swedish section, Arbetarmakt. And I wanted to raise another issue in relation to the pandemic, namely how revolutionaries should balance the evident and blatant need for street and public mobilization for fight back with the various legal and health-based difficulties one could encounter there. For example, here in Sweden, the reformist and centrist left mostly or completely canceled their traditional May 1st demonstrations on their own accord, despite the possibility of holding smaller legal assemblies in the name of respecting public health. And they've continued since to display what I can only call complete legalism and tailing the authorities in the face of the pandemic. We held a small May Day protest in Stockholm to make the point that we need to step up rather than wind down our activities facing the crisis. But I was curious to hear other comrades talk on sort of the different factors to balance here. Of course, we need to respect public health and social distancing, and as Marxists, respect science, really. But we also need to defend the right to protest and a free assembly and sort of have a creative approach there. So if other comrades or perhaps Roxanne have any points on how you from your own activity in different countries have approached the issue, I'd be interested in hearing it. And thanks for an interesting meeting.
Okay, Jason.
Yes. This is Jason Wright from Albany, New York. Here, Andrew Cuomo is the governor, and he's sort of emerged as the representative of neoliberalism par excellence. In part, I think, because Donald Trump is so bad and Joe Biden has been so milquetoast that it makes Cuomo look good. And that's in spite of not having moved to do containment until mid-March, despite the first COVID-19 cases probably having broken out in New York City in January, and the proposal to use nursing homes as emergency medical hospitals with predictably disastrous results. Nonetheless, the public workforce that I'm in and that Brother Myron is in, who I think commented earlier, is largely unionized. And I think as a result of that, we've been in the fortunate position where we are all still fully paid. And, you know, even with it not being any sort of socialist or revolutionary government, there's been a rational approach to being able to shift people's job functions around to have workers who'd normally be doing something else, processing unemployment claims, etc. You see a drastic distinction, though, between the unionized jobs and the jobs that can be converted to a remote sort of capacity, to the sort of jobs that Roxanne mentioned in her talk, that many working class people have, where really there is no relief other than the unemployment checks coming in, and those are only temporary at this point. And it's easy to imagine that large sectors of the economy are not going to be able to recover. The organized working class in the U.S. at this point is very small, and you know, so many workers have been deunionized over the process of deindustrialization that's occurred over the last 30 or 40 years. So while we see these wildcat strikes breaking out, while we see the resistance in the Amazon workforce and the warehouse workers and some of the gig economy, one of the contradictions that it poses, and I think it is, the challenge of what is the leadership of the working class and how do we fight for that, is that COVID-19 increases the atomization in many respects and the isolation in many respects. It poses new challenges. For instance, they're trying to have a demonstration here in Albany today around the murder of a black man that occurred in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which I'm sure is news all over the world. And there has been a sort of urban rebellion in Minneapolis too, and that is a part of the militancy of the US working class has often expressed itself in a violent, at times, resistance to the state, quite appropriately. Where we've had a certain disadvantage is in the degree to which the organization of the working class has been corroded over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think we're in a very challenging circumstance to try to rebuild that. But rebuilding that has to be a starting point for organizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, I've got Christoph. Aloha, unfortunately, seems to have dropped off the meeting. I've got Christoph next, and then I've got Stephen, and then Kathy Tom, so I presume it's Tom. So, Christoph.
Yes, hi there. I'm Christoph from the Bolshevik Tendency. I guess I want to talk briefly about capitalism and death, since there is such a close connection. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were a lot of comments that said, nobody could have predicted this. And I think this is true and not true at the same time. Of course, nobody could have predicted the exact time or location of the outbreak of a pandemic. But it was known that something like this was going to happen. It was so well established that public health departments in the UK, in the US, and other countries conducted regular simulations in order to figure out how to deal with such an outbreak, in order to prepare for the eventuality coming true. In the UK, one of those simulations concluded in its report that the capacity and staffing levels of care homes had to be significantly increased. That was one of the clear conclusions. Now, this conclusion was true, but was unfortunately not implemented. And a result of this lack of preparation is that the most vulnerable and most unprotected people are dying. In Britain, I think about a third of the deaths occurred in care homes because staffing levels are not adequate, capacity is not adequate. And in the healthcare environment, a lack of staffing leads literally to death of patients. Now in the US, Germany has been upheld as a sort of model in how to deal with the crisis, I think. And it is of course true that the mortality rate in Germany is lower. It's about 100 per 1 million in population compared to other countries. In Italy or Britain, it is 500 per 1 million, with the US being somewhere in the middle. Now, it is not really a surprise that Germany fared a little bit better, because they did not decimate the healthcare just as much as happened in Italy and the UK. So because there were more ICU units available, Germany could fare a little bit better and less people died. Again, I think this demonstrates the connection between capitalism not funding or even decimating, as in Britain, the healthcare system, and deaths. It is well known that UK and Italy and Germany to some extent introduced more private initiatives, more private investment, hospitals run for profit, and as a result, capacity and staffing levels decreased, and as a result of this, mortality during this crisis increased. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, Stephen.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess my number one criticism is your position on the logistics of how workers should organize in this situation isn't very clear. As far as I can tell, you agree with the notion of a complete lockdown, and as some others have commented, this poses problems for the workers, the working class, because to make a good example, suppose otherwise very, very healthy, confident, not scared workers decide that they don't like the way the more vulnerable sections of their staff are being harassed and threatened to go back into the workplace. So they decide they're going to go out and they're going to organize a picket line outside the workplace to prevent the more vulnerable sections of the working class from getting in. I mean, it's like, it's basically, it's saying, we're here to protect you. And this picket line is our way of enforcing that, workers should not be going into the workplace because of the health hazards. Now, if the cops come along, and in Britain at the moment, you're not allowed, more than 6 people at any time. If you've got 20 healthy workers in this picket line that may be obeying social distancing rules, and nevertheless, the cops are going to have that they're going to use that as an excuse to break up the picket line because, it's like there's a group of more than 6 people. So these workers know the risks, and they're going out because they're otherwise very, very healthy. They have no comorbidities, right? And your position, we would have nothing to say about that. My position is that, and this is a logistical position more than anything else, is that, and to avoid any controversy, we'll just imagine I was the health minister of some worker state. My position would be that there shouldn't be a complete lockdown, not for the biohazard level 2 coronavirus, but in fact, the most healthy sections of society should be allowed to get on with their lives, and society should instead take every single possible measure to protect those most vulnerable, right? Including those that may actually be otherwise fit and healthy, but don't want to take the risks as well. There is a civil liberties issue as well to this whole thing. So I don't think you have a coherent position on how to deal with the logistics from the point of view of working class organization in the capitalist countries on this. Now, there are obviously risks, and I think when we think about gun laws in the US, you're opposed to the banning of guns. We know that guns cause 15,000 deaths a year, but it would be inconsistent and incoherent for you to say, well, we want to ban guns, but because they cause deaths and we're humanitarians, but at the same time promote the class struggle. So obviously you're opposed to gun laws in the US, which is, that's the correct position to have. So I don't think you have a very nuanced or clear position even on the logistics, at least from the point of view of the working class, if not society as a whole, in terms of should we obey completely to the letter this lockdown, or should we not instead have a more nuanced position where we split society in terms of who should go
3
out,
minutes
and who shouldn't?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Then we've got the last speaker on the list. So unless someone puts their hand up quickly, we'll go back to Roxanne after this. I'm assuming this is Tom.
Yes, it is. It is Tom. Tom from the Bolshevik Tendency. I'm going to let Roxanne explain the coherence of our position on the health aspects of this and take up a few other things. Elliot raised the question about the planned economy and the declarations of the Chinese bureaucrats, the recent ones. I think one of the very significant things which I've seen, and I haven't really followed up in great detail, but apparently the economic lockdowns are hitting the Chinese private sector much more severely than the state-owned enterprises for obvious reasons. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the what Elliot's quoting is in fact an attempt to sort of buck up and encourage them. I think that when we look at China, we look at any major social phenomena, we have to judge phenomena on the basis of what is actually happening, not how it's being described or presented. So I suspect that there's a disparity there. The point about China and the turn of the American ruling class to China bashing is very significant and obviously very dangerous potentially geopolitically, and obviously from the point of view of the survival not only of the Chinese deformed worker state but potentially humanity itself in the event of a thermonuclear exchange. As recently as the 27th of March, Trump was still praising China and taken. At that point, it became clear to Trump that a miracle wasn't going to occur, and he wasn't going to escape the disaster in the United States. And so, crudely turned towards China bashing. The Democrats have joined in because they don't want to be seen as being soft. Robert raised the question earlier on about is this a situation where there's no way out for the ruling class? I think there is a real threat to the organized workers movement here. I think it's more acute than that faced by the ruling class currently. I think, however, this is a watershed, and I think that the dimensions of the economic disaster are very profound. I think that the United States, and with that the rest of the capitalist world, is going to be going into a deep depression. Right now, half of U.S. retail is estimated to be going bankrupt. We got 40 million unemployed in the United States, and of course every other capitalist country has similar situations going on. At the same time, there's huge social instability that is partly a result of the COVID crisis, but more generally about the conditions of life in the U.S. and the demonstrations we've seen recently about the murder of George Floyd are quite significant, but also the involvement of the bus drivers union in particular and other
that's 3 minutes.
Moving dimensions in the working class are potentially significant. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I've had Heiko indicate he wants to speak, and that is the last one. So we'll be moving to Roxy for a summary after this. Heiko.
Okay, I'm Heiko. I'm a PT supporter from Germany. And the first thing I want to say is that I think that it's right to say that the hospital system, the health system in Germany is still much better than in many other capitalist countries. But first, there were already neoliberal reforms on this. And the other point is that the shortcutting of the system were on the way when this virus came to Europe. And the virus stopped the health system shortcut thing. So the next point is that the question of how to mobilize workers against the capitalist offensive again for paying for the crisis is really difficult because of the lockdown. This is right. And one thing is, in Germany, the trade union and the revenues say, okay, we're doing nothing. Yeah, they're just saying it is okay to have a lockdown and to have a shutdown of the society, and we are doing nothing. And it was some radical lefts who are doing some 1st of May demonstration or now attacking the right wing, and idiots who are try to deny the virus or whatever. And the problem is that the reformist parties are part of many regional parliaments, so they can't play the opposition. So they are part of the game and they have to play it. And so they are acting as normal, not on a class struggle base, but on a making better government policy. And
1 minute.
It will serve the capitalist class and not the working class. And it's very clear that in the next week the German government will discuss the big and plans for making the working class pay for this crisis. And I can't see where the trade union or the left party trying to stop this. Okay, that was it.
It's in there. It's in there. It's there.
Okay, Roxy, 10 minutes summary.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. I'm going to deal with Steve and Svante's points first because they're kind of linked. Then I'll probably come back to China and some other bigger questions. Svante asked a sensible question, which is how can we actually fight back when we're trying to stick to social distancing, basically. And it's something that I've wondered myself, but I have seen exemplary examples from around the world of mostly organized workers of some kind or another creating demonstrations that are that observe social distancing and who are wearing masks. And I think that would be one of the main ways we would do it. But if pandemics become part of what we have to counter in this modern capitalist world, then we're going to have to get used to these ways of operating. We're going to need to control that PPE. That commodity is suddenly we see how precious it is. So workers are going to need to take control over that, just like other forms of production. But we'll be doing that for ourselves. Some of our own comrades were in a socially distanced demonstration on May Day in Hamburg. I think what we should also acknowledge is that that workers are going to go out, people are going to go out anyway, like what's happening in Minneapolis. We'll have situations more and more where people are not going to be paying any mind to it because their immediate priorities are different to that. So I agree that it's part of our job as Marxists to be observing that science and to be trying to maybe build it into the way that we organize. But again, I see it partly as an opportunity, and I'm going to link this to what Steve was saying as well, which is that what the pandemic does is it immediately frames everything in life and death terms. So when it's a chance to fight for better working conditions, which we've always been doing and which we have to do. But the argument, just like with lots of other climate change arguments, it becomes so much more immediate. We can't wait, So, for example, I think one of the key tools that we'll have in the future in the workplace that we need to be building are health and safety committees. The Bolshevik tendency is not, as a group at the moment, big enough in a position to be taking a leading role in that. But if I'm answering the question of what's objectively necessary, I think this is going to be really important to bypass the trade union bureaucracy. We want to be winning the leadership in the trade unions to be fighting for what's necessary. I think health and safety committees as a kind of transitional organization inside there could be one of the ways that we win people to immediate and necessary demands. I hope am I breaking up a bit?
It was a little bit, it's okay though.
Okay. Okay. So, and Steve's question was about your criticism was that we hadn't dealt with the logistics in a coherent way. I mean, firstly, this presentation was so its focus was on geopolitics. It was kind of a broad, sweeping presentation, and I don't think that would have been possible in a 30-minute presentation to deal with that. But I was predicting that it would be part of our discussion. I'm going to try and deal a little bit with what you've spoken about, but I think it's hard to do that again in a very small amount of time. But for example, what you describe, 6 workers on a picket line preventing vulnerable workers from coming in. I mean, that sounds like quite a potentially not such a likely scenario. Alan, you've frozen. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry, that's just a video. Just had some internet issues at this end. So, what I've experienced in my own workplace, even in the last few weeks in a secondary school in South East London, where I'm an English teacher, is that, as always, with the anti-trade union laws as they are in this country at the moment, as well as many places around the world, we're going to increasingly come into situations where we're not going to be able to achieve what we need to within a legal framework a lot of the time. You're going to often need more than 6 workers on a picket line. we're gonna, if we went on strike, for example, in the schools right now, it would be an illegal action because we don't have 60 days for the ballot that's now dictated. Teachers are talking about enacting Section 44 as an individual action, but this is kind of a temporary, desperate measure, really. What we need is collective action. So, we need comprehensive part of our program dealing with retraining, which a few people have talked about. What jobs are actually essential? We are going to be having to restructure our societies. When we're fighting for better working conditions, for example, in a meat packing plant in the US, and workers are just taking matters into their own hands and walking out because they're choosing not to expose themselves, we can take advantage of the fact that this is more than a reasonable request. So we can take advantage of that and intervene with that. The other element that you brought up was, should we be allowing healthy workers to be wandering around and just shielding the vulnerable? I mean, and there's a civil liberties argument. But from my understanding, this is not particularly logical necessarily because no one is immune. There are people around the world in their 20s and 30s dying from this disease. And also we need to remember what country we're in. That's happening in Brazil because of the poverty and the extent of the spread of the virus. So the demands there and the way that workers will act there will be different to what we do in the UK, for example. That there'll be a lot of overlap as well. But when people move around, they spread the virus, whether they are asymptomatic or don't get ill themselves or not very drastically, it's still going to be in the environment. And then when vulnerable workers or people come out, then it's just going to prolong the pain. What seems really obvious to me is that what needs to happen is that this virus is contained and killed. And you kind of forget that when you listen to the bourgeois media too much, I think sometimes, especially in Western European countries, where the herd immunity idea sort of seeps in all kinds of ways. Whereas actually in South Korea, in China, in lots of other areas in the world where they really went for it,
3 minutes.
3 minutes, in a very conscious way, their intention was to contain it. Then people can get back to everyday life. The more you play into the herd immunity aspect, the more everything is prolonged. It stays in the environment for longer. It's not inevitable that has to happen. Anyway, I hope that goes some way to answer some of the questions. I'll come back to Robert's question from the beginning. One thing I would say in answer to your question about what can capitalists get out of this, I agree, we don't want to go, I don't want to appear like this is some kind of catastrophism. I don't know if that's what you were partly getting at, Robert, but you mentioned the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which we also agree on as the overall tendency shaping capitalism, that lots of people who call themselves Marxists do not recognize as a decisive factor. But for example, you mentioned Trump, but yeah, the so-called onshoring of industry back to the US, for example, and other protectionist measures. Okay, you might get things the other way where there's a quick attempt to use cheap labor to increase surplus value, but mostly the trend is trying to invest in constant capital, in machinery, in technology, so that you can be competitive with other people in your sector, other capitalists in your sector. But of course, at some point when things even out, you're no longer competitive again, and we have the overall tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And so, although a capitalist might immediately get something out of it by, for example, being part of an onshoring program in the US, in the long run, capitalists are going to lose out, just like ordinary workers are. We have other phenomena like relocating to Venezuela, to Vietnam from China, because the working conditions are gradually improving there and no longer cheap enough for the US corporations to achieve their aims, for example. But anyway, I don't know if that partly answers one of your questions. But I suppose the point we're making in this forum is that although things will carry on with the same kind of patterns as they already have, that doesn't change the fact that overall we're moving into a new era where that social turmoil and the immediate need for change is going to become even more apparent, that is the case. Very quickly on China, just to add, I think Hans-Peter dealt with it to a certain extent, but I think
that's 10 minutes, so you can do this quickly.
In one sentence, China deformed worker state. Yeah, it's the bureaucracy is obviously complicit in the super exploitation of a lot of its workers in the Guangdong province, for example. But I think what's unique about the Trotskyist tradition that lots of other Marxists don't want to understand or can't understand, I think, is that we are not politically defending that bureaucracy. It's a social defense of that state. And I think what's hard to get our head around, especially with the strange historical anomaly of China, how is it able to do all the things it does? It does, South Korea and Germany are not sharing resources for free around the world. The CCP dictates what goes on. It has to work and trade with capitalists around the world, but overall the law of value is not what dictates what goes on there. And if counter-revolution occurred there, the equivalent kind of state, as I think Kathy also was intimating at before she got cut off there, is that the equivalent kind of in a semi-colonial country in the region, if we were to compare the living conditions of Chinese workers there to another kind of equivalent country with the size of population and so on, if those deformed planning elements weren't present as they are in China, I just finished the sentence, then we know that the living conditions of the Chinese working class and peasantry would be a lot lower. And that's why, as Trotskyists, we defend the right of China to defend itself against imperialists, and the tasks of Trotskyists and the Chinese working class there are different to what they would be here in the UK, and that's or anywhere other than the deformed worker states. That's what's important to recognise. So it's a bit rushed there, but that's my time.
Okay, I've got a comment by Elliot in the chat, which I'll read out, and Robert indicated he'd like to speak again, so we'll hopefully have a short second round. So Elliot said, Stephen Brown ignores the fact that asymptomatic people can still have COVID-19 and spread it to others. This program, in quotes, that apparently healthy, in quotes, people should not be able to lock down is as stupid as Trump's policy. Fortunately, he, that is Stephen Brown, I think, is not health minister for any deformed or healthy worker state. In the US, workers have organised car caravan protests and strikers, for example, shutting down McDonald's restaurants by continuously driving through the drive-through so that customers cannot purchase food to take out. The Labour Action Committee to Free Mumia Abu Jamal organised a car caravan protest outside San Quentin prison, accompanied by a press conference in front of the prison. Clearly, during the pandemic, different forms of protest will have to evolve to deal with the logistics problems of how to conduct a mass protest but not spread the virus. Thanks for that, Elliot. Robert.
Right wing is doing that as well.
Hello, am I on?
Yep.
Okay, cool. In terms of workers' organisation, I don't have any answers to that, but I do want to note that in 1919, during the global flu pandemic, about a fifth of the US workforce was on strike at some point. There were mass waves of strikes at the same time as there were waves of the pandemic flu coming through. So I don't know, I think that's obviously a period worth studying. And in response to the questions on China, we're not claiming that China is a socialist utopia. It's a planned economy with a bureaucratic Stalinist cast, and significant elements of its economy are either like directly capitalist in Macau, Hong Kong, the special economic zones, or are by necessity tightly coupled to the rest of the capitalist world economy. We don't have a socialist world order. And to paraphrase an article in Monthly Review, In 2012, there was an article in The Lancet that looked at historical data from 1940 to project where the next pandemics would arise. And they had a map, and the hotspots were China, India, Indonesia, Latin America, bits of Africa. And this rule was a focus on the outbreak zones. And because, of course, the capitalists backing this study was funded in part by agribusiness, by Colgate and Johnson & Johnson. They want to pin responsibility for the outbreaks on indigenous populations and their dirty cultural practices. If you remap this in terms of relational geographies, in terms of the circuits of capital, then you suddenly see that New York, London, Hong Kong, Frankfurt are the hotspots. And I think it's very important to understand that, you know, okay, it came from like a bat, someone ate a bat somewhere. Why are people being pushed further and further into regions of deforestation and closer to wild animals? And yeah, and whereas in contrast to that, in 2015, and this comes back to the point of could we have predicted this? 2015, we had the book, what was it? Big Farmers Make Big Flu. Yeah, I mean, this is big pharma, agribusiness, the circuits of capital. You have to follow all of these and not just look at, oh, these diseases come from dirty Africans and Chinese, which I think is, you know, you're in danger of having a very colonial attitude here without even realizing it, unless you really go back and understand where is the money coming from, where is the money going to, who is being employed, where are the profits being circulated to, the entire global capitalist system. Yeah, that's it. Okay, thank you.
Hello?
Yeah, that book that Robert referred to, Big Pharma, Big Flu, is by Rob Wallace. He's done, if you search YouTube for him, he's done a number of very interesting videos about this question. Stephen. If I can unmute you, unmute.
I'm mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you now. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So, Roxy, when I made the point about the strike, I was talking about 20 people, not 6, just to make the point that it was a group greater than 6, so that the cops would have a reason to break it up. Because, you know, with the slight relaxation of lockdown at the moment, you can. I don't know if I think it's still restricted to private spaces though. But the example was, let's say that you relaxed it even more to just, you know, 6 in public. I was making the point that there were 20 on strike there, and the cops would have a reason to break it up because they were, you know, it was breaking their lockdown conditions. So you would have the other thing is, I mean, people have alluded to the riots, and riots and revolution, in fact, cannot be done with social distancing and masks. These riots, there's no way that how are people going to observe when people are running around fighting cops on the street? It's ridiculous to say stay 2 meters apart. It's not have people attached magnetic fields to themselves to prevent themselves from getting close to each other. It's not meaningful. I don't think you have a coherent position on this. I really don't. And also the kill the virus approach is just the opposite side of the coin to the herd immunity for everybody. We know that this virus can come back. Second and third waves. Are you saying that we have to, you know, stay in this continual period of lockdown every time the government says so? Because that's basically where you're coming from on this. So, you know, the whole partitioning society between those that could survive under herd immunity and those that can't, and managing that splitting of society, I believe, is the right approach from a general logistical point of view. Obviously, it's complicated by how workers organize and what the capitalists are trying to do in the imperialist heartlands. But this is why I brought up the issue of the strike, and so I wanted to show how workers organizing, you know, abiding by the partitioning principle could not only not be enforced by, you know, the diktat of the bourgeois government and the clamping down of civil liberties, but also take the opportunity to protect the more vulnerable sections of society. So I honestly don't see the asymptomatic argument is a you know, is a red herring to me. I mean, viruses can lay dormant in people for a long time. Yeah, I mean, they can become hosts in people for a long time. The asymptomatic argument, again, is another. It's another prison sentence for the rest of the population for, you know, an indefinite period of time. And this plays into the hands, you know, of what the governments, the governments in the imperialist heartlands are trying to do in this situation to really take away, you know, the already quite paltry civil liberties that we have. I myself am not a fan of, for instance, 5G. And I know that a lot of people who would otherwise have been, you know, questioning this technology, which is being rolled out in contravention to the Nuremberg Code, you know, just don't have the opportunity anymore. And as soon as you question anything like that, you know, it's like, oh, you're just some tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist or something. So I think this is a bad day. This is a
That's
bad
3 minutes.
last few months.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. I've now got Anne and then Myron.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so basically I just wanted to come back to this point about the nature of the Chinese state and economy. The point that I was trying to make, I mean, Rob, I think his name Rob, referred there to Rob Wallace's book, Big Pharma's Big Flu, which I am actually in the process of reading, and I've read a number of his articles and I've listened to a number of his talks, and I would actually say that the points that he makes in those talks and in his book actually support my argument that the Chinese economy is part and parcel of the world capitalist economy. It is integrated, because if that wasn't the case, why then would the virus spread? The first place it spread was to Italy, because of the connections between the Chinese, the rag trade, the factories, which I think are extremely inhumane. Perhaps I don't know that there are other factories run by the states that are good, but then there are these other factories that are run by capitalists, which are really bad. Anyway, besides that, the connections between the Chinese economy, Chinese capital, and Italian capital, that's how it came. So China is integrated into the world capitalist economy. The Chinese government is obviously effective insofar as it can exert control over society in a way that the likes of Donald Trump and those others don't, because of the nature of the bureaucracy and its hold over society. That's why it can be more effective. And like you make the point earlier about the PPE, and obviously we were glad to get the PPE, but I don't think that the Chinese government gave it away for free. They sold it, didn't they? They sold it to Europe and other parts of the world, and in fact actually quite a lot of it was quite poor quality because of I think again the nature of Chinese of factories in China, particularly with the rag trade, with clothing, tends to be, you know, of poor quality. So really that's my point. I'm saying to you, right, you at least have to raise a question mark over your analysis when you can see that this virus, I mean, people have said about it, the wet market. I don't think you can, if you read Rob Wallace's arguments, you cannot separate off that from the nature of the industrialized farming and agriculture and the erosion of the wild. Anyway, so my main point is that this society is part and parcel of the world economy and is part of the problem for the working class, really. Okay, thanks.
Alan, you
Okay,
muted.
I have Myron next and then Hans-Peter on the list. Myron.
Howdy. I do want to, my name's Myron. I was invited by fellow worker Jason, and I'm also here in New York State. And I'm a member of the industrial workers of the world, upstate New York, James Connolly branch. And I agree with Anne in regards to China and its relationship to the capitalist situation. But I principally wanted to mention a couple things about COVID-19. We had some discussion about organization, and COVID-19 is a part of a family of 7 viruses, 4 of which usually cause the common cold. Then we have 3 that kill people. 4 do not impart immunity, and then the 3 that kill people tend to, at least to a certain degree. And in the discussion about having healthy workers going about their life and then having the sick protected somehow, that's not possible when you have an asymptomatic virus of this type, that certain individuals can be entirely asymptomatic. Most people who come down with it are asymptomatic for 3 days or 2 days, and they're most contagious the day prior to their expressing of conditions. The other 2 viruses which are related to this that are killing people is MERS and SARS, and neither of those are contagious prior to expression. So it is possible to have a contingent of seemingly healthy individuals spreading this to people who unknowingly spreading it. And so the question of civil liberties is brought up, but we very rarely discuss about societal liberties and the rights of the community. And I believe it would be reasonably argued that the rights of the community, and particularly if you're dealing with a socialist or communist or anarchist organization, it would be improper to disregard those people who could be potentially gotten sick as a result of an action that you've taken. And so I would say you need to do PPE. You need to do all that stuff. There was a comment about 1919 and the Spanish flu, which incidentally was most likely started in Kansas. But the strikes, and here in the States, I wanted to comment that time period was the first Red Scare. And so there are huge crackdowns, largely because of organizing by workers. So we do need to examine that. And I wanted to say that all organizing should be done on the floor up. So local people would meet creatively the requirements to avoid these conflicts that we're discussing, like a limit of 6 people. There are creative alternatives that people can do for themselves. And finally, I wanted to say in the United States in general, there is a intellectual disconnect that is difficult to overcome between class warfare and the unions. And that is a challenge that we have to overcome so that business union members are fully aware and cognizant of this class warfare and the conflict with capitalism. And that's all I got to say.
Thanks, Myron. Okay, I've got Hans-Peter and then Ian, and then there'll be time, I think, for discussion, and we'll go back to Roxy for a summary after that. Hans-Peter.
Yeah, just to come back to China's integration in the world economy. I mean, that's undoubtedly true that China is integrated, and that was a conscious effort that the Deng government started in 1978. And as I said earlier, the plan was there to allow, in a very prescribed way, for foreign capitalists to come into the country, basically under sweatshop conditions, which would be policed by the CCP and their armed forces. But at the same time gaining access to Western technology, because in 1978, the Chinese worker state was extremely poor and economically backward, despite the Mao period, which did actually sort of render some economic growth since 1949. That was noteworthy. And yes, these sweatshop conditions, to an extent, still exist in China. There's no doubt about that. And obviously, Ian has correctly noted that it's kind of evident huge danger that your own country that will destabilize the economy and will foster strength amongst the pro-capitalist bureaucrats of the Communist Party, and that's definitely happened. But it's actually quite funny, since 2008, since the big capitalist crisis, which obviously hit the Chinese manufacturing export sector, which is primarily dominated by foreign capital and sort of supplier manufacturers, local private Chinese companies mostly. The majority of the CCP has actually rethought their approach, and I wouldn't take Xi Jinping's comments on the decisive role of the market too seriously. We've had similar expressions from his predecessor, Hu Jintao.
1 minute.
I think it was the 13th plan from 2016 to 2020 by the CCP had similar wording, actually, talking about the decisive role of the market and so on. But at the same time, and that was sort of less looked at by Western commentators who were sort of enthused about how China will now supposedly open up in the very same state-owned enterprises. And I think Thomas correctly said we should look more at the actions that the CCP carries out rather than the sort of fancy talk that they sometimes use to attract Western investment. And again, in terms of the working conditions, just to stress this point again, we have had quite a few US, Taiwanese, South Korean, Japanese businesses moving out of China because the Communist Party, partly on the back of massive worker strikes in the coastal provinces, have decided that the wages there have risen so much and the working conditions improved so much that they get better conditions for exploitation in poorer Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Ian.
Sorry,
and then we'll go to Roxy for a final summary.
Yeah. Okay, just a couple of points. I mean, on this question of organising during the pandemic, there is no easy answer to this because, the question of asymptomatic carriers is a live issue. I mean, one of the things that we've been pushing on, and even this is a bit makeshift, is the question of the strikes and stayaways. I mean, one of the things in Britain that actually shut down the schools was people boycotting the schools, because they were not safe. And I think, obviously this is a complex question, how you actually deal with things like demonstrations and picket lines and whatever. But I mean, I think it's quite difficult. I mean, a pandemic situation is obviously not the ideal situation to organise working class action, but on the other hand, it poses the question of workers' safety in the most sharp manner imaginable, and produces a whole lot of complex tactical problems, which are, I mean, we can't really wish them away. So I don't think there's any easy answer to that, except we've got to feel our way through it and try to put forward suggestions that proposals that maintain people's safety and at the same time advance the struggle. And that might sound a bit abstract, but that's where we are. On the question of China, somebody raised the question of I can't remember who it was who said that China is not neoliberal, is not a neoliberal capitalist regime. I agree, it's not a neoliberal capitalist regime, but that doesn't mean it's not a capitalist regime, because neoliberalism is not the only form of capitalism that's possible. And I think what the comrades said about the 1991 August coup, I think has some relevance to this, in that the Yanayev side had a program of slow motion capitalist restoration and keeping the state intact. And I think that's basically what the Chinese bureaucracy did. They are as pro-capitalist as Stalinism in general. Its policy was to maintain the unity of the state and create a form of capitalist restoration that did not cause the social disintegration and destructive manner of, subordination to imperialism that happened in Russia. And, I think it's a straw man to talk about neoliberalism. I think China is somewhat different. It's a weird animal. It is marked, obviously, by the Chinese Revolution and by its which had a nationalist element to it, a very strong nationalist element to it. which has come to the fore, at the same time it's creating a kind of a bourgeoisie which is interpenetrating with the bureaucracy, and it's a strong bourgeoisie. I mean, as I pointed out earlier, it's got more, there are more billionaires than in the United States. Of course, it's a much bigger country than the United States, but nevertheless, you know, this is a capitalist country. It's integrated into the world market in a unique manner. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Ian. Okay, Roxy, summary. If you can try and keep it to 5, but I'll give you another couple if you're running out of trouble.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the things, for example, on China, have largely been dealt with. We'll see how we go. Yeah. One thing I think that it's important to note, and I obviously don't agree with Steve's point on herd immunity, but what he does bring up that's important, I think, is the question of civil liberties. But I think it would be a mistake to think that we can then somehow solve this in the capitalist's own terms. Just like every other element that the capitalists have taken advantage of, these things were on the cards already. A lot of the infringements on civil liberties were already happening. Some of the developments are really worrying, you know, ways in which we can hide the deaths from corona by, you know, not even declaring, you know, being able to properly say goodbye to our loved ones when they die, not being able to have any control over those processes, and the state, as it would, taking advantage of that, all of the surveillance that I mentioned in the meeting. But we're going to have to counter these things anyway. So, you know, it's not just corona that's caused it, just as it hasn't the economic crisis. So the ways in which we counter it, our tasks are going to be hard no matter what. And the question of social distancing is just one aspect. I mean, you know, you talked about masks, but, you know, if our masks are really good and they're fit for purpose, then you can be nearer somebody than you would be without one, that the social distancing is actually based on as well. And I think that those arguments that you put forward are actually very defeatist and very dangerous, and they'd be quite hard to explain and justify to the majority of workers as well. In terms of, you know, where the virus comes from, I know where Rob was coming from when in his reply to Anne. I can see that Anne obviously was not talking about kind of that sort of slightly colonial rhetoric. That's not where she was coming from. But I suppose my point to Anne is that, yes, of course, the Chinese state is connected to trade in the rest of the world, and Hans-Peter commented on that as well. But my point is that then doesn't automatically mean that it's a capitalist state. You know, the Chinese deformed worker state has to trade with capitalist states in a globalized economy. It's got no choice but to do that. So it's not evidence in and of itself that it's therefore capitalist. And we, as I've said, we are not romanticizing that state. I mean, maybe I'll end on mentioning 1989, that Hans-Peter started to talk about but ran out of time, as an example for where we're coming from as Trotskyists when we try to make the distinction between political and social revolution. In this state where a social revolution has happened in 1949, that our tasks are different there. So, for example, in 1989, when workers fought against privatizations and against the bureaucracy and were brutally suppressed by the bureaucracy, we wholly condemn that, because those are the kinds of actions that we want and need to be behind. Workers themselves trying to take things into their own hands to change their society. But if we just put it into the capitalist camp, then we're not recognizing the gains that are also there. And it has to be a nuanced position. And I think, like, people often jump back and forth and assume that you're just supporting the bureaucracy if you recognize that this state is just run differently to imperialist states.
1 minute.
trying to think if there's anything I hadn't come back on. Oh, maybe just I know Elliot made a point about the car caravans, they're called. Yeah, I mean, exactly. We'll find new ways of organizing. Someone made the point about how a pandemic does make us more atomized, though, and that's really true. So, for example, the internet is a really good tool, obviously. We're all here today. It's also another way that we're surveyed, but then where aren't we surveyed? We have to be wary of it, but we also have to organize. But the right wing have also organized car caravans. There was a massive one in Spain recently, I think it was. The far-right organization there organizing big car caravans. So, you know, the working class is going to find creative answers to these. But the question is, with what program are we going to meet people? Probably leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Roxy. And thank you for everyone who attended and the people who contributed to the discussion. I thought it was a good, healthy discussion, good comradely debate. This is obviously our first attempt at doing this kind of online meeting, and as the chair, I'm quite pleased that the only glitch I had was against one of my own comrades and cutting her short. It may be that we try these again in the future, and just to repeat that, we will be hoping to put this up as an audio recording on our website, bolsheviktendency.org, sometime soon in the future. So thank you all very much for attending, and have a lovely day, whatever's left of it. It's very nice where I am. I'm going to go for a walk after I have some dinner. Thank you very much. Goodbye.